So back in the 70s, there was this guy who got hired to make a slasher movie. He had a really good feeling about it, so he demanded his name be put before the title, and he handled as much of the movie's production that he could all by himself. The producers agreed, and he ended up making the best slasher movie of all time, and he put the genre on the map. The producers really wanted a sequel, he didn't really want to make one, but they offered him more money, so he decided to do it, and that created a massive franchise. At that point, he bailed out and started directing his own awesome horror movies, but they never really reached the heights of that original slasher. And now, over 40 years later, he kind of hates that billion-dollar franchise he created. The guy we're talking about is John Carpenter, and he created Halloween. Welcome to Real Ones. Before I tell you all about how John Carpenter grew to hate his greatest works, I gotta tell you all about my Patreon, which is free to follow. The reason I need a Patreon for this channel is because of YouTube's absolutely pathetic, abysmal content ID system that eviscerates any video that uses music or footage from movies. Here on YouTube, you're getting the theatrical cut. So remember in the 80s when they would cut all the best stuff out of Friday the 13th movies? That's what YouTube is making me do here. If you want the director's cut, the full vision for this video, check out my Patreon, which again is free to follow. It's linked in the description and the pinned comment, but with that out of the way, let's talk about John Carpenter. Look, I'm just gonna say it, Halloween is the greatest slasher movie ever made. There's a million reasons as to why, but I'll just list a few. There's its perfect title, its awesome poster that if you look really close, you can actually see a hand holding a knife. There's also its simplicity and its mission to tell a perfectly crafted story about a mass murderer escaping a mental asylum and coming home to terrorize a high schooler and her group of friends. And of course, there's its theme song, which hasn't been left off a Halloween playlist since it came out in 1978. And most importantly, there's its villain, Michael Myers, or the Shape if you want to get technical. His mask is right there behind me, and he has one mission and one mission only: to come home and kill people on Halloween night. And let's be fair here, any of those reasons could explain the success of a slasher movie during the late 70s or early 80s, and there were a ton of them coming out back then. And most, if not all of them, are kept alive to this day by a small group of hardcore fans, but if you want to make the Mount Rushmore of recognizable slasher villains, it would include A Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger, Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees, and of course, Halloween's Michael Myers. And when you compare Michael Myers to his other murderer contemporaries, I think he has by far the biggest reach, even if people always call him Jason and think he's from Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th just has a better name, I'm sorry. Halloween's reach is even more impressive when you look at the release calendar of the 1980s and realize that A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th were pumping out sequels left and right, but Halloween only had 2 movies released in the entire decade. But to understand why October 25th, 1978 is such a monumental date in the world of horror, not even just slasher movies, the entire genre as a whole, we've got to go way back to 1953 when John Carpenter, who was 5 years old, ended up in Bowling Green, Kentucky because his dad accepted a job as a professor. Growing up on a college campus sounds incredibly boring for a 5-year-old. I mean, you can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't party, there's no kids around, you're basically left up to your imagination. And we all know the 60s were a crazy time from talking to our parents, but John Carpenter, again, was a 5-year-old, so he wasn't concerned with the geopolitical things going on, and thankfully, he was able to find his escape in movies. If you're a Carpenter fan, his 2 favorite genres aren't going to surprise you. It's sci-fis and westerns. I mean, take a look at his filmography and you'll see inspirations from those genres everywhere. Escape from New York is a retro future western that stars one of the biggest regular western actors of all time, Kurt Russell, who's personally my favorite actor. And then The Thing is a remake of one of John Carpenter's childhood favorites, The Thing from Another World. And when you watch his movies, you can immediately see the biggest influence that sci-fis and westerns had on them, which is of course the insane practical effects. If you're new here, which you definitely are because this is the first video I'm uploading on the channel, I'll tell you right now, I'm not the biggest fan of even the best CGI. I don't care if it's a mediocre practical effect. A practical effect makes the movie look more believable to me and helps me escape into its world. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that when I see something done practically, I can imagine it happening to me better, and that ultimately makes the movie more cool or scary. And it seems like a young John Carpenter felt pretty similarly, because in multiple interviews, he said that the thing that made him want to direct movies was seeing the movie It Came from Outer Space. During one scene, a meteor flew towards the screen, and as he put it, it exploded in his face, and it scared him so bad he ran to the back of the theater to watch the rest of the movie. I know that sounds weird for multiple reasons, but I read a bunch of interviews where he talked about this, and not a single one mentions that It Came from Outer Space was a 3D movie, so that should contextualize one of the reasons it sounds weird. In all seriousness, that experience really stuck with him, and his dad noticed, so he hand-me-down gifted him an 8mm camera. I don't want to gas up his dad too much because it wasn't one of those moments where a father gifts a son something to nurture his talents. It was more that his dad bought a movie camera to make movies and absolutely hated it, so he just gave his kid the camera, and the timing worked out really good. And that camera also came along with a splicer and a projector, so by the age of 14, John Carpenter had the ability to make a silent movie. And these days, you can make anything from a YouTube video all the way up to a theatrical film like Unsane with an iPhone, but back then, this technology was super expensive, so it actually is awesome that he was able to do it at such a young age. As for the movies he made, he says they're unwatchable, but I'm sure they're pretty solid, and I wish someone would upload them to YouTube because it would be cool to be able to see that history. Anyway, after he graduated high school, he went to college in Kentucky before he dropped out to join his band, the Coupe de Villes. I'm gonna drop a fact that a hardcore Halloween fan will pretend they always knew, but no one really knew this until Halloween 2018's marketing happened, but the original Michael Myers, Nick Castle, the guy who played Michael in most of the scenes, he was in the band, the Coupe de Villes, which is kind of sweet. So that band went overseas to tour, and they played at a USO show, and on a table next to John Carpenter was a magazine that was advertising film school. And again, they didn't have the internet, and film school was a new thing. He didn't even know it was real, so he was excited to read about it in a magazine. That experience got Carpenter to want to direct movies again, so he flew home to Kentucky and applied at USC, and then he got in. He picked USC because he had heard they had connections to the movie industry, and to him, that meant getting a job out of college. And his time at USC is where Carpenter's film career really got started because he met a guy named Dan O'Bannon, and together they made his directorial debut, Dark Star. No one really talks about that movie, but it is really important because Carpenter learned a lot of valuable lessons while making it that he would carry throughout his entire career. See, Carpenter also grew up with a musical background, which put him in a really unique position because he was also a multitasker. So on Dark Star, Dan O'Bannon handled the effects, but Carpenter did pretty much everything else. He produced it, he wrote it, he directed it, and he scored it, and that kept the budget low at around $60,000. If you convert that to today's money, that would be like 370 grand, which sounds like a lot, but Jason Blum gives his directors $5 million budgets, and that's considered dirt cheap in the movie industry. So there's some context for you. If you were a good kid in school like me, you know that doing all the work on a group project never results in getting all the credit. And the reason I bring that up is that after Dark Star, O'Bannon got to do the special effects on Star Wars, and then he got to write Alien, and Carpenter didn't really get any kind of come up from it, but he wasn't discouraged, so he started working on his next feature, Assault on Precinct 13, which he also wrote, scored, and directed. And it was on that project in 1976 when he met his longtime collaborator, Deborah Hill. Assault on Precinct 13 is where Carpenter really developed his style. I really like the movie. It's a siege movie that takes place in a police station that's being attacked by a gang, and it opens up with a kid getting shot through an ice cream cone, so it sets the tone immediately, and it never really lets up from there. And it's an important movie to his career because it's where he gained this forward-thinking sensibility in terms of quality. He wanted it to stand up to the test of time, so he spent a little bit more on the camera, which was from Panavision, and he also rented anamorphic lenses, which give the frame a sort of widescreen look and a warped sort of feel that gives it a more cinematic look and tone. He ended up using that camera and lens setup for the vast majority of his movies, and if you're addicted to buying 4K Blu-rays like I am, you're like immediately struck with how good his movies look compared to other low-budget movies from the time. So even though Carpenter wasn't skyrocketed to the big leagues straight out of college like Dan O'Bannon, it really worked out for the best because Assault on Precinct 13 was purchased for distribution at the festival it premiered at by a producer named Irwin Yablans. It's a weird situation because it wasn't widely distributed here in the US, but it was overseas, and it built up a pretty big following and became a financial success, and enough people saw it here in the United States to develop a cult following for Carpenter, which is all great for his career. And that brings us right up to his next project, Halloween, which is of course not only the most important one for this video, but arguably his entire career. So Yablans really liked what he saw out of Carpenter's work on Assault on Precinct 13, so while he was on his way back from the film festival he bought it at, he started thinking up an idea for a slasher movie that was tailor-made for John Carpenter. When Yablans got back, he presented the idea to Carpenter and said, "Hey man, I want you to write, score, and direct this movie, and I will give you $10,000 up front." And it was during this negotiation process where Carpenter thought back to Dark Star and the experience he had making it, where he did a lot of the work and got a little bit of success, and he said, okay, this time we're doing things different. See, Carpenter knew that being able to wear multiple hats and wear those hats well set him apart from his peers, so he hit Yablin's back with a few demands of his own. First, he asked for complete creative control, which was a big ask for someone that early in their career, and at the time he was doing it, it was basically unheard of. I mean, it's still a hard ask today. But since Yablin's came up with the project for Carpenter in the first place and was only paying him 10 grand to do it, he said, yeah, that's fine, but Carpenter had more demands. The second one was for Deborah Hill to co-write and produce the project with him, which was a much bigger ask because at the time, Deborah Hill had zero experience producing. And third, he wanted his name above the title on the project, which is why horror fans call Halloween John Carpenter's Halloween to this day. This is one of many moments in this video where, at least to me, Yablin seems like one of the coolest producers ever, because he said yeah and then took the movie over to Mustafa Akkad to present it to him for money, and that name's gonna sound really familiar if you're a Halloween fan because his company, Trancast International Pictures, still owns the Halloween IP to this day. And Akkad really liked what he heard too, so he gave Yablin's 300 grand to finance the project, and then this time around, instead of being an active participant like he was in most of the movies until he died, he took a step back and said, I just want to make some money without doing any work. So with the financing in place, Carpenter and Hill got to work with a divide and conquer mentality. Carpenter handled the more supernatural aspects of Michael's backstory, and his premise there was that most American small towns have either a haunted house or a creepy story that parents will tell kids so they don't stay out after dark. He also came up with Dr. Loomis and the whole backstory where he's the only person who understands how dangerous Michael is, and he'll do anything to stop him, sort of like the Van Helsing to Michael's Dracula. And Michael Myers, scarily enough, was pulled from John Carpenter's memory, so when he was younger, he toured a mental asylum and a schizophrenic guy stared at him, and that stare was like seared into his mind, so he wanted to take that stare and make it into a slasher movie villain. And that was a great idea, because I think it's that emptiness, like how you can never see Michael's eyes behind the mask, that really make him stand out from Freddy and Jason. Jason's motive, as we all know, is revenge for the killing of his mother, who was beheaded at the end of the original Friday the 13th. And Freddy is also out for revenge. He targets the children of the parents who live on Elm Street, who burned him alive after he found out what he was doing to their kids. And unlike them and every other slasher villain, Michael Myers has no motive. If you encounter him on Halloween night, your odds of survival are 0. And even if you do manage to defeat him on Halloween night, he's always gonna come back. So if you survive, you're gonna be looking over your shoulder for however long or short your life is, and he will come back to finish the job. And I'm not saying that makes Halloween better than Friday the 13th or A Nightmare on Elm Street. If you like those movies' backstories, that's 100% fine. But for me, what's always made Michael cooler and more memorable than the other two is the fact that if you cross his path, you are marked for life. He will kill you at some point. Anyway, another super smart tactic that the duo employed while writing Halloween was starting with the scares. So instead of writing out the whole movie's plot and then working scares in after the fact, they started with the actual kill scenes and then wrote the outline around them. You might think that decision is inconsequential at first, but I promise it isn't. Because that decision alone started an arms race in the 1980s for every single slasher movie to have the goriest practical kills put to film. And I'll never argue with you if you acknowledge that during the end of the 80s, both Nightmare and Friday started to lose steam, but during the early years, they were cooking. Friday has some truly insane kills, from the arrow through Kevin Bacon's neck, Julius getting his head punched off in one hit, and that amazing wheelchair kill. And then way later on in the remake, I like when that chick gets stabbed through the dock with the machete. I always laugh at that. My wife hates it. And A Nightmare on Elm Street has almost too many to count, but the ones that still stick out to me are the goopy stairs, the blood pooling on the ceiling, and then in Nightmare on Elm Street 4, when Freddy turns that girl into a cockroach and crunches her in the trap. Oh, that one, I can't watch that still to this day. I look it up on YouTube, I always hit pause and turn it off. The point is, we have Halloween to thank for those kills, because without that movie, people would have never been shown what they didn't know they wanted to see. Scary shit. Bob's death, where Michael lifts him up by his throat and pins him to a kitchen cabinet with a knife, is one that used to make me close my eyes as a kid. And seeing Annie Brackett's body laid out in the bed in front of Judith Meyer's gravestone next to a flickering jack-o'-lantern was so cool that I took a picture of the TV with my mom's camera and made her take me to Walgreens the next day to get it developed. And you'll know this if you ever took a picture of your TV when you were trying to save a Mega Man code or something, but that picture came out as a blob. And I've also always loved Halloween because it features jack-o'-lanterns so prominently. Outside of stuff like Trick or Treat or a few other indie movies like maybe Dark Harvest, you don't see a lot of jack-o'-lanterns in horror movies, which I think is dumb. Once Carpenter and Hill finished the script, they presented it to Yablans, who, unlike pretty much every other producer ever, had some great ideas of his own. The first idea he had was that the movie should take place all in one night, and second, it should take place on the holiday of Halloween. Setting the movie all on one night would give them more money for the effects and the kills, which was super smart because they could just shoot out the day stuff and then focus on what mattered. And having it take place on Halloween was not only a great idea because no other movie had done that at that point, it also gave them the perfect one-word title, and it was much better than the original title, which was The Babysitter Murders. So with the script in place, the crew got to work on casting the movie and, actually filming it. And when they started casting it, Carpenter was immediately met with a huge problem, that $300,000 budget. See, Carpenter and Hill already had some people in mind for some of the roles in the movie, like Dr. Loomis was basically typecast for Donald Pleasance. And at that time, Pleasance was a really well-known actor, like he was up there, so to get him to sign on, they had to promise him $20,000 up front and a Winnebago that he could retire to when he wasn't filming. And then Jamie Lee Curtis was handpicked for the role of Laurie Strode because of her connection to Janet Leigh, the star of Psycho. They also wanted her because she was well known for her scream being pretty wicked, so to get her on board, they had to pay her $6,000. Because of those upfront costs burning through their budget pretty quickly, they knew they had to be cheap on everything else they could, so for all the actors' costumes, they got them at JCPenney. That limited budget, for all the problems it caused, also resulted in one of the best masks in history. Instead of sculpting Michael's mask from scratch like they originally wanted to do, they ended up just buying a Captain Kirk mask from the store, and they cut out the eye holes, painted it white, and messed up the hair a bit. And hey, Slasher fan, I know you probably knew that, but there are people watching this video that didn't, so just leave me alone. And even though the movie took place in Illinois, they didn't have enough money to actually film there, so they just did their best to avoid palm trees in shots, and they filled a trash bag with dead leaves, and then they would drop it on the ground for a shot, and then collect them all to move them around for later. I'm sure having to stretch things as far as they didn't help at all when it came to like stress on making the movie, but it helped Carpenter hone his skill of making his movies look like they cost a lot more than they did. So that was really important. Once they got done shooting the movie, Carpenter got to work scoring it, which he claims only took a week, and that iconic theme I mentioned at the beginning of the video, he claims he wrote that in an hour. Well, in some interviews he says that, and in others he says it took a couple of days. It doesn't matter. The whole point is he wrote one of the most iconic movie themes ever in a very short period of time. Halloween premiered one day before its theatrical release on October 24th, 1978, and it was an immediate success. It made over $70 million in its box office run, which makes it one of the most profitable indie movies of all time. And just to drive that point home, $70 million in today money is $350 million, which technically makes it the most profitable Halloween movie ever. So with Halloween's huge numbers, you'd think that Carpenter would want to jump right in and make a sequel. Well, that wasn't the case. In Carpenter's mind, he went for broke with Halloween, so he didn't think there was really much story left to tell. And I know you're sitting there like, what about that ending where Michael Myers gets shot 6 times and falls out a window only to disappear out into the night? To me, in 2024, that would be like clear sequel bait, but Carpenter has been adamant for decades that he only did that to terrify the audience. And to be fair to him, there were no Marvel movies at that time where they teased sequels at the end of the credits or anything like that, and the idea of Michael disappearing would tell the audience that he could be waiting for them in their backyard, or next Halloween he might break into their house and cut them down like he did Laurie Strode's friends. And I saw Halloween when I was way too young on AMC Fear Fest. I didn't get to see Halloween 2 for a few more years, so I really took it that way when I was a little kid, and Michael Myers scared me very badly. Like, I'll freely admit that when I was in elementary school during the month of October, I'd walk home from school just a little bit faster in case Michael Myers was behind a bush. So Carpenter was done with Halloween. He wanted to move on to his next project almost immediately, but if you make the most successful indie movie at the time, it's gonna need a sequel. So Yablans and Akkad went to Carpenter, they got on their hands and knees, and they begged him to come back. And after a long deliberation that I'm sure included an ever-increasing fee for Carpenter to come back, he agreed to do a sequel. At that time, Carpenter and Hill were already shooting their next movie, The Fog, so they spent some time between takes and at night writing the script for Halloween 2. And as for that script, as Carpenter puts it, it was mainly dealt with a lot of beer sitting in front of a typewriter saying, "What the fuck am I doing? I don't know." And while the resulting movie is definitely rougher than the original Halloween, I think it still stands up in its own right, and when you watch it, it's very easy to see why it spawned 11 more sequels over a 40-year period, and of course, generated a $1 billion franchise. I just don't like that it introduces the idea of Laurie being Michael's sister, because to me, that makes Michael 1000% less scary. Think about it. Unless you know Laurie Strode Strode, you're never going to encounter Michael Myers. But since you guys are my friends, I'll admit that even after I saw Halloween 2 and didn't like that one part of it, I still walked a little bit faster during the month of October. The weird thing about Halloween 2 though is that once it came out, it actually had a pretty steep financial drop off from the original Halloween. It ended up making around half of what Halloween did, which was still good, but it also cost a lot more to make at around $2.5 million, and Carpenter used that as sort of an excuse to move on from Halloween for good. I watched a lot of interviews with John Carpenter while I was writing this video, and no matter what he's talking about, he always has this sense of bitterness when he's talking about his old movies, and it's weird because if you look at his filmography, you could pick out pretty much any of his movies as your favorite and no one would argue with you, so like you'd think he'd have a big sense of confidence. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it's easy to see why he has that tone of bitterness. Carpenter's entire filmography followed the same pattern. He would release a movie, it would be panned critically, it would not make a lot of money, and then like a decade later, it would be revered as a classic. Anyway, it created this paradox where Carpenter became the master of horror, but he wasn't the master of money, at least at first. So we just talked about how his movies didn't make money when they came out, but the reason they did later is because of that remake craze that happened during the 2000s and the 2010s. Studios rated his entire filmography for remakes, and even though only a couple of them made a lot of money, like Rob Zombie's Halloween, it didn't really matter because this time around he got paid up front. He explained it like this: there are two kinds of remakes for me. One is where I'm the originator of the material. I wrote the screenplay. Two, it was an assignment from the studio. We want you to do this. If it's an assignment from the studio, they don't pay me when they do a remake. They own the material. If I've generated the screenplay, they have to pay me. That's the kind of sequel I like. So I went and I took a look at Carpenter's IMDb, and based on that criteria, he got paid for Halloween 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, H2O, Resurrection, 2007, 2009, and then he got even more money for Halloween 2018, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends, because not only did he executive produce those movies, he also scored them, and he made the original material, so he got paid a ton of money for those ones. And then when you look at other remakes like Assault on Precinct 13, The Fog, and The Thing, even though none of those made a lot of money, he got paid before they even went into production. Carpenter, he's a complicated guy though. Even though he got that late career influx of cash, it didn't really fix his tone of bitterness that he has when he talks about his movies. When one interviewer asked him if he revisits his movies, he said, "Never. I don't want to see it. When I watch my old movies, I see the mistakes and the things I didn't do, and I start looking like, what am I doing? That's stupid. Why didn't I do this? That's painful. I don't want to do that, so I don't watch." He clearly cares about his work, but if you're an artist who cares about your work, it's really easy to look at your old material and get down in the dumps. And with Carpenter, I got to imagine that it's 10 times worse than with other directors, because for the first half of his career, when he was actually making movies, he had to deal with low budgets, scrappy productions, and low box office turnouts. And on top of that, when he did get a big budget for a movie like Escape from LA or Village of the Damned, those movies still underperformed big time, so he didn't make a lot of money. The most devastating example of that is, of course, The Thing. I mean, that movie is as close to flawless as it gets. If you ask 5 horror fans what their top 10 horror movies ever are, all of them are going to put The Thing in at least the top 3. But when it came out, it was a completely different story. The Thing had a lot going against it, starting out with the fact that it came out in June of 1982. First off, it was going up against a Steven Spielberg movie, so like for any director out there, that's a David versus Goliath situation to the maximum degree. And that Spielberg movie was E.T. So on top of the fact that it's one of his biggest movies ever, it was also an alien movie, and it had a completely different tone, like the exact opposite tone of The Thing. So when people wanted to go to the movies, they picked E.T. 9 times out of 10. It also went up against one of Ridley Scott's favorite movies, Blade Runner. Yes, he made that movie. And even though that movie was revered much later as well, it had the same situation with E.T. where it got absolutely stomped. And when The Thing and Blade Runner and E.T. came out, the US was in a recession, and there's so many studies that show you people go see happy movies when they're depressed, and nothing makes people more depressed than a recession. And if you go back and read reviews, you will be blown away by the fact that critics hated the effects, but if you read a little bit deeper into the review, you'll realize that it wasn't because the effects were bad in their minds, it was because the effects were too good and it scared them too much, which is absolutely weak. It's pitiful. It's pathetic. And when I say the thing bombed, it absolutely cratered, man. It only made $19 million on its $15 million budget, which like is not a profit in any stretch of the imagination, because horror movies have to make 2.5 times their budget to actually make money, because the budget does not account for marketing. But thankfully, if you're a Carpenter fan and you like him as much as I do, you'll be happy to know that his retirement era is going fine. He's kicking back, he's watching basketball, and he's playing a ton of video games like Fallout 76, Horizon Zero Dawn, Ratchet & Clank, and The Last of Us Part 2, which is awesome for me to read in an interview, because if you didn't know, I have a PlayStation channel called PS Ready. I absolutely love PlayStation. And his ability to score movies came back to help him later, because while he doesn't really direct anything anymore, he does come back and score movies like Halloween 2018, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends. And while reactions are mixed on that trilogy, which I think is completely fair, I don't think anyone can argue that the scores in those movies is the best in the entire Halloween franchise. If you haven't sat down and listened to his music without the movies, I recommend doing it because it's great. His Lost Themes albums are excellent, and also the theme song for Halloween Ends is the best rendition of the Halloween theme, and The Shape Hunts Allison is by far his best track, period. I'm really happy things worked out for him in the end, because he is far from the only director who's had that experience of releasing a movie back in the 80s or 90s, having people hate it when it came out or not see it, and then have it be discovered way later than it actually matters for them, you know, making money. And if you're looking for some deep cut Carpenter classics, I recommend checking out In the Mouth of Madness, Christine, and Prince of Darkness. Looking back at Halloween and the rest of Carpenter's work has been a really fun experience, because it mapped out a strategy that he had that carried him throughout his entire career and really set him apart: the ability to do pretty much everything himself. From directing to writing to producing to scoring, Carpenter had his hands on almost every aspect of all of his movies, going up until his last one, The Ward, and that's been a guiding principle for me when it comes to making YouTube videos. The more you do on a project, the better you're going to hone your skills and the better your next project is going to be. And who knows, you might end up defining a genre. And sometimes, even if you're just in it for the payout, you might end up making a sequel that generates $1 billion franchise that you don't really like or even love all that much. But that brings us to the end of this story about John Carpenter and this episode of Real Ones. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a ton of fun to make, shoot, edit, and do everything else on. Again, if you want to see the director's cut of this video, check out my Patreon, which is free to follow. It's linked down in the description. Anyway, guys, as always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.